Hi, I'm with Christine Adams, the emotional conditioning expert. She's a child and adult psychiatrist with over 40 years experience, and she's co-author with mentor Homer B. Martin, MD, of Living on Automatic: How Emotional Conditioning Shapes Our Lives and Relationships. The book concerns a groundbreaking new concept of personalities and how people relate to one another. Christine has had frequent appearances on radio, teaches classes on emotional conditioning, and is author of numerous professional psychiatry articles and book chapters, and presenter at national and international psychiatry meetings. Welcome, Christine. Glad to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So why don't we just start with a good basic question, like what is emotional conditioning?
Emotional conditioning is a wonderful, interesting new discovery by Dr. Martin. It concerns the way that parents shape their children by age 3 to conduct their relationships, to experience their emotions, and to show their behaviors in life. And the very dramatic thing about it is parents don't know they're doing it to their children, and the children don't know what's happening to them. So it's all sort of unconscious, nobody's aware of it, but it happens very early in life, and it affects everything that you do for the rest of your life.
And what's your story behind this? How did you first come to realize that emotional conditioning existed?
Well, I was out of medical school and in my first year of residency training in psychiatry, and I was working with individual patients, mostly adults, and I began to realize that a person in one family was very much like a person in another family, but they were unrelated. And yet these same people were very different from people within their own families. And I thought, isn't that interesting? People are conducting their relationships the same way across different families. And so that started me asking, why does this happen this way? What's going on? What causes this? And is this indeed true? In which case I'll have to check it out by looking at more people over time to see if it is true. So I got very curious about this. And I was asking my supervisors about it, and they were all sort of saying, well, this can't be true, or you've got it wrong, or something else is going on. And then I met Dr. Martin, who was assigned to be one of my supervisors. And he said, well, this sounds very interesting, and here's what I'm involved in, and I'm wondering if this could be part of emotional conditioning, which is the same in different families of all cultures, backgrounds, the same with kids of different genders, different sexes, different religious upbringings. And so that's when we started working together, and he helped me to understand that indeed this was emotional conditioning.
How long have you been studying this?
Well, I've been involved for 40 years,
It's 40 years.
and he was involved another 40 years.
So really pioneers in the field.
Yes,
Yeah.
we are.
Very exciting work. Could you give us some examples of emotional conditioning?
Yes, I can. Let's take marriage. Commonly, marriages take place between people of opposite personalities. So a very shy, reserved, nerdy type of person will be attracted to a very outgoing person who is not so conscientious, who may not make the top grades in school, who is the life of the party. And they'll see this person in a social encounter, and they'll say, oh, isn't that neat? That other person is so different from me, and I like that. And they'll get together and they'll get married, and then after a few years of marriage, they'll realize the thing that we originally liked about each other is driving us crazy with one another now. We can't communicate, we misunderstand one another, we can't get along, and that is emotional conditioning. That's how it works in marriages.
And that goes back to childhood. And is emotional conditioning really affected by one's parents and they're sending that on? Or
Well, what happens is each successive generation of people gets emotionally conditioned, and then they do the same emotional conditioning to their offspring, and then they do it to their grandchildren, and so on. So it repeats, and since it's unknown to everybody what they're doing, it goes along like a snowball rolling down the hill and happens to everybody over time.
So when you're counseling somebody and you know emotional conditioning is almost always going to come up, what are some of the breakthroughs that happen, or how do you even introduce the idea to your clients?
Well, I have to see what they tell me about their background and their memories, and they have to back it up with data, with realistic factual information. In other words, it's not sufficient that somebody comes in and says, well, I was terribly abused as a child. I have to say, well, tell me how, when, the circumstances, tell me what you remember of the events, because I have to see, is it real or is it a figment of their imagination? So as you explore with a person what really happened in their life, you see a pattern of how they conduct their relationships. And then you also get the history of how they were raised as children to see what that pattern was. And then you can begin to interpret to them, I think you were conditioned in such and such a way or in a different way. And that's how you use it.
So you gave an example of emotional conditioning in marriages. How about between siblings?
Well, very often in families, parents will come in and tell me, I've got two children that are dramatically opposite from one another. One is very conscientious, gets good grades in school, is never a problem, and the other one is always, I'm tearing my hair out about this kid. He's rambunctious, he doesn't mind, he's not the best student. He makes friends with everybody, but he can't keep them, or she. There's no difference in sex or gender. This is an example of emotional conditioning. We emotionally condition our children differently, and we have a hard time emotionally conditioning balanced children with a little bit of the other's attributes. So that's all emotional conditioning among siblings and among families.
So families, how about the workplace?
Well, I think most of us have been in workplaces where we see people of different personality types, which means the conditioning produces the differences in personalities. And you'll go to work and you'll have some people that are go-getters and they work very hard and they accomplish a lot and they're willing to stay late and pick up slack. And then you have other people who aren't so invested and they like to cut out early and they like to manipulate other people and say, will you do this job for me? And that's an example of emotional conditioning and how it impacts the workplace. So you have some people that will buoy up a workplace and be very goal-oriented and strive to get to what the boss wants or the company wants. And you'll have other people that always want to throw a monkey wrench into the work situation. And what happens is the one who likes to shirk work gets the other people to do the work for a while, and then those people get mad and they get aggrieved and they burn out and they get disgruntled, and then you'll see an organization has big problems and they'll often consult somebody like me about what is our problem? Why can't we achieve our goals? Why is everybody unhappy? Why are some people not doing work? So that's how you see emotional conditioning alive in the workplace.
I know one thing you've told me is no one escapes this. Everybody's been emotionally conditioned. Is that right?
Right.
And sometimes does emotional conditioning of a certain kind lead to physical illness? Or mental illness? Or is it, so we all have it, but are there extreme examples?
Well, the interesting thing about conditioning is it goes all the way from very mild conditioning to very severe. And we're all in this population somewhere. Some of us are mild, moderate, severe. And severe enough emotional conditioning can create a severe emotional illness. And mild emotional conditioning, or moderate, creates all the same emotional turmoil that we all have in life. You know, times we get angry at what's going on at work, or we get sad with what's happening to a friend or what's happening to us. So those are all normal emotional feelings. And what tips it over into emotional illness is if we get depressed or so anxious that we can't function. We have a hard time getting out of bed, we have a hard time going to work, we have a hard time running our life. Now, emotional illness is very different than mental illness. See, we're all prone to emotional illnesses because of our emotional conditioning. But mental illnesses are illnesses of the brain. They're more like neurological illnesses that affect our emotions and behaviors. And the two main ones are schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And over the years, they have found that these remain constant in all populations of the world. 2 to 3% for schizophrenia, 3 to 5% for bipolar disorder. And they're largely treatable with medications. But emotional illness problems are largely treatable by correcting the problems in your relationships, not a pill.
So you've helped thousands of people, helping them understand emotional conditioning and get through the problems they're facing, but I bet there's things you've learned about it for your own personal life. Anything about emotional conditioning that helped you make decisions about relationships or?
Oh, absolutely, every day. But I'll tell you one example. When I was divorced and I started dating again, I used all of these concepts that worked with my patients, and I applied them to myself. And I said, okay, I'm going out into the world to meet new men, in my case, and see what they're like. And let me use some of these principles to evaluate other people, other men, and see what they're like in dating. So that's what I did. And I had to go against my personal style of being conditioned to stretch myself. See, conditioning confines you to a rather narrow role in life. So in order to be a full person, you have to break out of your conditioned environment and stretch yourself and try new things. So I learned to do that. I learned to look for a different type of man, and I was successful. I found a lovely husband.
You got him. I just met him. He's a good guy and
wonderful.
clearly loves
Been
you very
married
much.
3.5 years.
Yeah, and it's clear that it's a great relationship.
It is.
So you have this wonderful new book, Living on Automatic. What's the story behind writing it?
Wow, that's quite a story. Dr. Martin, who was my mentor, started writing it probably in the 80s. He started gathering data for it in the late 60s. And he wrote on it for 22 years. And then he died in 2007. And his wife, Jane, asked me if I would finish the book and get it published. And I've been working on it now 6 years.
Wow. Just give us one or two things you talk about in the book, tips or strategies or just some insights that I'll get from reading this book that has filled with great information. But what's one or two teasers out of it that you can share with us?
I think the most important thing to get out of the book is that unlike self-help books, which give you strategies for doing things, our book helps you discover what emotional conditioning is, how it impacts your life, and then lets you have the sort of aha moments and lets you make decisions about, well, now that I have this data and information, I can decide what to do with it. But at the end of the book, there are some ways of distilling the information, I would say, that are things like, to override your conditioning, you need to stop having automatic knee-jerk reactions in your relationships. And the way you do this is whenever somebody asks something of you or something is expected of you, you say, wait a minute, let me think about that and I'll get back to you. And when you think about something and you engage your brain, you override the automatic response of conditioning. And that allows you to think of all the other possibilities that there are for what to do in a certain situation rather than the knee-jerk one. The other thing that I think is helpful is that if you want to know what another person is really like, ask them a question. Not a yes-no type of question, but ask them a question about what their opinion is, what they think about something. Because when you ask a person a question, you get at how that person sees the world. And when you understand how they see the world, you can evaluate what type of person this is. And that goes deeper than gender or skin color or religious upbringing. So that's another tidbit.
What kind of problems does the book talk about that can be solved here?
Some of the problems that people come to me with about marriage are, why do I keep marrying the same person again and again? Then the parents come to me with problems about, why do I have such different children and they both are giving me fits? And then in the workplace, people come to me with, why do I have this workmate that always expects me to do her work? Siblings, a lot of the time, one child will come in to see me and say, you know, my brother beats me up, and my parents don't do anything about it. So siblings are curious about, why does one of us kids get away with all sorts of stuff in the family, and the other one, me, gets held accountable for his stuff?
That's great. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading your book, and I know you've made me far more aware that emotional conditioning exists. And I think I'm going to get a lot of strategies how to really identify it in my relationships and my work. And so this is great. I've been with Dr. Christine Adams, author of Living on Automatic: How Emotional Conditioning Shapes Our Lives and Relationships. Thanks so much for being with me today.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.